So welcome to a bit of a Life Talks extended edition with Lia Mills. She's going to be talking today about just some more pro-life arguments, particularly with a feminist lens. So Lia has done a lot of study with in feminist theory and understanding the language of that. And so she's going to add that lens to some of the things we'll talk about today. And we particularly thought we would do a webinar on this because the feedback from Life Talks was very much that people wanted just to know more about how to articulate their pro-life views. And they really, of course, loved hearing Lia speak. So welcome to everyone. We're very happy to be able to offer this, and we're very thankful to Lia for taking the time that is required to plan for something like this and to take the time today to share with us. So Lia, I'm going to hand things over to you and let you speak. And if everyone can just make sure that they are on mute, then we'll get started here. So Lia, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Aaliyah, for that introduction. You guys, I'm flattered that people enjoyed hearing me speak. I don't know if my family would agree with that statement, but hopefully it'll be an engaging time. And like Aaliyah mentioned, there'll be a time for questions and answers at the end. I'm going to try to keep this relatively brief and not going too in depth into any one argument, just because I know that different people have been faced with different questions and arguments that they find personally very challenging, and so I want to make sure that this is matching the audience we have here. Maybe I'll start with a short couple-minute introduction about who I am, because it's not every day you have just some random young woman talking to you about these issues, and so the condensed version of the story is way back when I was young and spry. I was in grade 7, and I was asked to write a speech as part of an English class project, and I was told that I could write about anything I wanted, and there was attached to the project a competition. And I was a very competitive person, still am. I like to say I'm a recovering competitive person, and so I really wanted to win the speech competition. And and I also had a difficult time figuring out what topic I was going to write, so I decided to pray and ask God what topic he thought I should write, and I was kind of hoping he would give me the winning topic. He knew the desires of my heart, and so I was like, hey God, what topic should I write about? And he suggested the topic of abortion, and I was 12 at the time, so I was not familiar with the issue of abortion much at all, and my family was not involved in the pro-life movement in an active capacity whatsoever. And so I very naively said, sure, that sounds like a great topic. And that's when I started doing research on my own on the issue of abortion. And for those of you who are on the webinar, you're likely already aware of where things are in Canada. But for those who aren't, we have approximately 100,000 abortions every year. Those are kind of trying to factor in the abortions that aren't reported, because there aren't requirements that every province provide statistics about how many abortions are performed, and we also don't really know how many abortions are taking place right now accurately with the RU486 abortion pill. And so at this point, we kind of guesstimate that we're at 100,000 abortions every year in Canada. We've had completely unrestricted abortion access, in that abortion is not criminalized. And so we have a decriminalized state in Canada where abortion can be obtained if you can find a doctor to do one. You can obtain an abortion all the way up until 9 months. And Canada is actually the only country in the world, certainly the only democratic country. We're not really sure where the laws are in North Korea. There's not a lot of information provided about them as a country, but every democratic country has some restrictions on abortion, and Canada is the only democratic nation, and my understanding is the only nation in the world that has no restrictions on abortion. And so again, that means you can have an abortion because the child is female, because the child might have a disability, or just because you decide that it's summer and you want to look good and you don't want to be pregnant during the summer. And so finding this out when I was 12, I was really concerned about this. And I went to my teacher and told her I wanted to write about this, but I was in a public school in Toronto. And so you can imagine how that would have gone down. And so I was told that the topic was way too big and too mature and too controversial. And that if I decided to go ahead with the speech topic, that I would be disqualified from the speech competition. That kind of started a whole fiasco that I can go into if you're really curious. I've also written a book, so you can find out all the juicy tidbits there. And the book is called An Inconvenient Life for anyone who's interested in finding out more information about that. But the long and short is that I didn't win the speech competition. But while all of that was happening, my parents, who initially were very opposed to me writing about this topic, they realized how important this was to me. And so they decided that they wanted to show some friends the speech that I had done. They were really proud of me. They thought I was super cute, and I like to say that I was. And so they decided that they were going to record a video and post it on YouTube just to show a few friends. And so we watched the views go up, and my dad was the one who would watch them, and he'd say, Leah, there are 7 views or 24 views. And at about 100 views, I think my head grew a couple sizes, and I was like, wow, I'm doing pretty well. 100 views on YouTube, that's a big deal. But God had other plans, and so the views continued increasing into the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. And currently the video has over 3 million views. And then there are other videos that have been like remakes of it where they've translated it into different languages, that kind of thing. And so all of that is kind of what started and launched me into the abortion debate. I was 12. I was not really expecting it to go where it's gone. I've now been talking about this for, how old am I? 11 years. And so it's almost half my lifetime, which is pretty wild. And so, yeah, I go by a fake last name because when my video first went viral, we started receiving a lot of death threats, and there were people who found out information about my family. And so, anyway, we've had to take some safety precautions, but the reality is that God has protected me, and I've gone on for the last 11 years to do this work. It's something that I'm very passionate about, something I can't really imagine my life without, as I'm sure many of you could attest to yourselves. And so over the last 11 years, I think that I've learned a lot. I've made a lot of mistakes and used a lot of really poor arguments to respond to people. So I've learned a lot about how I think it is best to navigate difficult conversations about the issue of abortion. As Lia mentioned, I also studied feminism in my undergrad, so I have a degree in political science and women's studies, and I just finished my degree in law. And so I'm able to kind of comment and draw on those backgrounds, especially the feminist background, to kind of help us unpack what the pro-abortion stance is, what are the beliefs that inform their worldview, and how we as pro-life people can really clearly articulate our arguments and our position. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to share my screen. Oh, Aaliyah, it says that the host has disabled screen sharing. So if you could enable that for me, that would be awesome. In the meantime.
Hey, sorry, I'm just kind of figuring that out.
No worries. No worries. It's probably one of the, like when you set up the webinar, it's probably one of the choices that you pick.
Are you able to yet?
Oh, I have hope. Yes, it looks like we're good. Great. Okay, awesome. Okay, so today I'm going to make what I call a case for life. Maybe that's my legal background coming in, but I'm going to make a case for life. And at the end, hopefully I'm going to get to some of the content I would have started talking about in the actual virtual life talks, which will look at the question of, is it possible to be pro-woman, pro-choice, and pro-life? And I'll kind of unpack those terms and what I mean by those, because it's purposely meant to sound kind of confusing, so I'll get to that in a second. But really, I think it's important as pro-lifers that we are able to articulate a pro-life worldview. I would say especially from a place of science and reason, and not only a place of our own faith background. I am someone who is a strong Christian, and I love God, and I've clearly included God in my story about how I've gotten involved, because that's just the truth, and you give credit where credit is due. But I think it's important when we're reaching out to our non-Christian or our secular colleagues, friends, peers, other people in society, family members maybe, it's important that we're able to meet them where they're at and still be able to clearly articulate a pro-life worldview without having to rely on maybe some of the really important faith-based reasons as to why we are personally pro-life. The other thing I'll say is I started off, when I started doing research on the issue of abortion, I actually maybe naively first kind of concluded, oh my goodness, this is what abortion is. There's no way that anyone could support this. And that's when I found out that there were people who supported abortion. And I learned a lot about the pro-choice and pro-abortion movement and their worldview and what informs them. And I think it's really important, for me at least, it was very important that I had that background, because it enabled me to be very clear with how I responded to that worldview. Because sometimes I think pro-lifers in the past, at least, we've maybe missed the mark in terms of we've either made accusations or brought arguments that really had nothing to do with what pro-abortion people really believe. And so, it's not true that people who are supportive of abortion just love, killing children. That might be kind of how we feel in the moment, but that's not true. And there are really complicated, difficult reasons as to why people support abortion. And so it's helpful to know what those are before we actually can respond appropriately, so we can respond appropriately. So what I'm going to do first is kind of review, including a little bit of a feminist worldview, shall we say. I'm going to review some of the reasons as to why people are pro-abortion and why they have the stance that they have. So this will be a quick skim through of the pro-abortion perspective. So can everyone see all right? You can just be nodding. I'm hoping that this isn't okay. Great. I have some nods. Awesome. So I think one of the big ideas, and this is one you'll likely have come in contact with before, is this idea of reproductive rights. And some of the language has changed into reproductive justice. And it's this idea that it's the woman's body, and so it's the woman's choice. You'll all be familiar with that language, I'm sure. It gets a little exhausting, but that's kind of the, it's my body, my choice argument. And the reasoning behind this is basically that, it's a woman's body who goes through all of the changes when she becomes pregnant. And so she should have the ability to choose not to become pregnant. And that would go into questions of birth control, that would go into questions of IVF and a lot more complicated, controversial issues as well. So we won't talk about those today, but the idea of reproductive rights is, it's not just about abortion, but it's this very holistic idea of, a woman's reproductive system is within her own body, and she should be able to control how it functions, and she should be able to control whether she becomes pregnant, and if she so chooses, whether she stays pregnant if she does become pregnant. And so that's one of the really core ideas. There's also this understanding of abortion just being a medical procedure. It's healthcare. It's no different than having your tonsils or your appendix removed. There are a lot of feminist thinkers who will start using the term, abortion access is very common, but abortion care is something that people talk about a lot. And it's this idea that abortion is essential for a woman's physical, emotional, and mental well-being, and that denying her access to abortion care would be harmful to her. So there's really a big focus on the woman, and obviously, maybe our critique is that the child gets left out of that analysis, but there is this desire to really care for and help women. And then the last idea that I have up here is abortion on demand, and this is more extreme. Not everyone in the pro-abortion world in the pro-abortion movement, or not everyone who has a pro-abortion worldview would believe this, but a lot of people do, and this is kind of where we're at in Canada, which is that you can have the ability to have an abortion at any stage during a pregnancy for any reason or no reason at all. And this is kind of a really extreme extension of a lot of these ideas, and it's this idea that a woman shouldn't have to justify the actions that she takes or the choices she makes. And so instead of having women explain, I was in a really tough financial place and this is why I had the abortion, feminists would really advocate for abortion on demand, so that abortion is destigmatized. If you chose to have it, no one questions your decision. You don't need to have a reason, and we don't evaluate whether your reason is a quote unquote legitimate one or not. So this would be more on the extreme end. So, and just so you're aware, the reason I'm using the term pro-abortion is because I think, maybe two reasons. First is because I think if people are really supportive of abortion, that they shouldn't mind the idea that they're supportive of abortion. I think that's a fair articulation of their perspective. Sometimes when I'm in conversation with people, I do use the term that they would prefer. So if they would prefer pro-choice, and if I think that will make the conversation go a little easier, then maybe I won't push it too hard. But I also think that I'm someone who supports choices in certain contexts, not abortion as a choice, but other choices, right? And so I think the term pro-choice is a little deceptive or just unclear, in that there are a whole lot of people who support choices that aren't abortion, and so I can be pro-choice without necessarily being pro-abortion, if that makes any sense. And so you can choose where you lie on in terms of the actual rhetoric, but that's just why I'm using the term pro-abortion, if anyone had any questions about that. Okay. So now here are some of the key pro-abortion arguments, and you'll likely be familiar with a whole bunch of them. There's the woman's body, woman's choice argument, or my body, my choice. There's the argument, which I don't hear as much, but it is one of the arguments that would have really started the pro-abortion movement. So it's an argument that Henry Morgentaler, who was the abortionist who overturned the laws, or helped overturn the laws in 1988. He argued that every child should be a wanted child. And there was this idea that, if a child was going to be born into a context where he or she was unwanted, that it would be better for that child, and better for the family as a whole, but really better for the child if they weren't born at all. There is this idea that if abortion is made illegal, women will end up at back alley butchers. They'll still be having abortions, but they'll just be unsafe abortions. And so there's the argument that abortion saves women's lives. So again, you see a lot of that focus being on the woman and what's in her best interests. There's the concern that a woman shouldn't be forced to carry a child who is conceived in rape or incest. And then last but not least, this one I hear less frequently, but sometimes even if you can get someone to accept that the unborn child has rights, they'll argue that the rights of the fetus, if they have any, do not trump the rights of the woman, that the woman is more important, and therefore abortion is still okay. So we can see a lot of these arguments actually reflecting reasons why women choose abortions. And these are some of the stats we have. They would have been taken from Planned Parenthood in the United States. And so they're pretty accurate and would be accepted by pro-abortion individuals. And so we can see that there are a lot of serious concerns that people have about, finances, their life-changing relationship problems, age, and then down there at the bottom we see some concerns about health of the fetus, health of the woman, and issues of rape and incest. And so again, I think it's important, as pro-lifers, if we're wanting to have a really clear, articulate response to the issue of abortion, we need to remember that there are reasons why people choose to have abortion. It's not just, they just like ending the lives of children. That's not what it's about. There are underlying reasons, and the sooner we can identify those, the sooner we're able to offer a really respectful and helpful response to that, if that makes any sense. So I skipped ahead there a little too soon. Okay, so all of the pro-abortion worldview ultimately rests on one underlying assumption, and that's the assumption that the fetus is not a separate living human entity. This really is something that will often not be articulated clearly in a conversation when you're having an argument with someone, or a respectful conversation with someone. They'll often be saying things that this belief that the fetus is not a separate living human entity, it must be true if their argument is going to logically follow and be actually viable, if that makes any sense. And so I'll get to some explanations in a moment, but maybe an example would be, people will say, well, the woman has a lot of financial concerns, and so in this context, abortion is best for her. We would never say that in a context where you're talking about abortion ending the life of a human being. If abortion was a procedure that we accepted ended the life of a human being, then you would never say that financial problems justify murder or justify ending the lives of other human beings. And so in order for their argument to be acceptable, they need to believe that the fetus is not a separate living human entity. And so often the belief is that the fetus maybe is something that will become a human at one point, something that has the potential. It's a potential human life. I often hear references to it just being clumps of cells or a blob of tissue, that kind of thing. And then some people go so far as to say, I hear this a lot in the feminist community, is that the fetus is a parasite, that it functions, it lives off of the woman's body like like a parasite lives off of a host, and that it really is a parasitic relationship. And so that's kind of how they think about the unborn child or the human fetus. So that's kind of the pro-abortion worldview, and that's really important because then we get to the pro-life perspective. Now, before I get to the pro-life perspective, I want to give you a hypothetical example. So let's say I know this 17-year-old girl, and she's just lost her job, and she's been kicked out of her home because she can't be supporting herself financially, and her family isn't supportive of maybe her life choices. And so she's now struggling with homelessness, some serious financial problems. She's in an abusive relationship, and so she's very, very concerned for her well-being because of the actions of her abusive boyfriend. In addition to all of that, she just found out that she has cancer, and her child was conceived in rape. Now, regardless of what you personally think, in a pro-abortion person's mind, would abortion be justified? Regardless of what you personally think, from a pro-abortion perspective, I'm seeing, for the few people who have their videos on, I'm seeing some nods. So, right, again, we don't really agree. I'm sure if you're here, we probably don't agree. But from a pro-abortion perspective, that woman has every reason imaginable to pursue an abortion. Her life is in danger. Her child was conceived in rape. She has some serious financial problems. She doesn't have any support. And so a pro-abortion response would be to look at this 17-year-old girl and say, you know what, have an abortion, and that will be the best solution to your crisis pregnancy or your crisis situation. But if I told you that this was her child, and all of the factors were still true, she's still homeless, she's still in an abusive relationship, she still has cancer, this child was still conceived in rape, would we say that ending the life of this child, that having, quote unquote, aborting or just ending the life of this child would be acceptable? I see people shaking their head, which is awesome. Sometimes when I use this example at high schools, they're not very engaged. And so I say it and no one's shaking their head. And I'm like, come on, guys, come on. No, this is not okay. And it's not okay because we look at this child and we say, this is a human being. And regardless of the horrible life circumstances, and they are horrible, this woman is facing a lot of really serious concerns. Her life is in a really difficult place, and we can understand that and empathize with her, but that doesn't justify any response. It doesn't justify ending the life of this child, even if this child, might have needs and bring additional financial burdens, shall we say, on the 17-year-old mother. And so this is where we see a big conflict between the pro-abortion and the pro-life perspective, because from a pro-abortion perspective, this child is clearly a human being, but because she's been born, because she's older, because of her age and her size, she's not in the woman's body, she's exited, she's born already, and so of course she's a human being. But from a pro-life perspective, there's no difference between this child and the unborn human fetus or the unborn child, because the size really doesn't matter, the age doesn't really matter. What we're talking about is still a separate living human entity. And this is the foundation, I would argue, of the pro-life perspective. And this is why pro-abortion people and pro-life people often talk past each other in conversations, because if you don't address this key question, then you don't get to the root issue. And so why is this question important? Why is it important that we have these different underlying assumptions? Well, it's important because if the fetus is not a human, then there's really no need to justify abortion. It wouldn't be killing anything. And so, if the fetus is in fact just, a blob of tissue and a clump of cells, then there's no need to justify abortion. I would have wasted the last 11 years of my life. We would have all these organizations doing really unnecessary work, because abortion wouldn't be killing anything if the fetus is not a human. But I would argue that if the fetus is a human, then no justification for abortion is adequate, because abortion would end the life of a human being, of a separate, living, distinct human entity. And I would argue that in a context like that, what you're saying is you're giving someone the ability, the right to end the life of another human being. And we don't do that. We don't in our society. We have pretty strong moral beliefs around those things. We don't even have capital punishment in Canada, right? And so the question then is, are the unborn human? Now, there are really complex analyses that can go into this question. I've heard it, and I will credit this absolutely to Stephanie Gray from the Canadian Centre for Bioethical Reform, or she was there at the time. She's a brilliant apologist, and she breaks it down into three simple, really easy to remember explanations and ways to articulate to someone why the unborn child is in fact a human. So we'll just go through these really quick. So first, fact, this is a scientific fact. If something is growing, it's considered life. It's considered to be alive. So we know that the human fetus is growing. It starts as one cell and then divides into 2 and then into 4 and then into 8, et cetera, et cetera. So the fetus, the human fetus is definitely alive. The other thing I'll add is that people will, like I said, will use the terms clumps of cells or blob of tissue as though they're dehumanizing. They'll say, it's just a clump of cells. And in that comment, it's being articulated indirectly that the unborn child isn't human, that it's not valuable. But realistically, all of us are just clumps of cells. If you're made of anything other than cells, this is what I tell the young people, if you're made of anything other than cells, I'm really worried about you. Why we should get you medical attention immediately, because all of us are just really highly organized, maybe quite attractive clumps of cells, but we're clumps of cells. We are human tissue. So the question is not, are you just a clump of cells? We're all cells. The question is, what kind of cells? Well, in this case, we're human tissue, human cells. And what's also important to remember is that, people will often come to me and say, by your argumentation, every time that a couple have intercourse, or every time that a woman has her period, that is the loss of human life because it's human cells. And that's where I'm like, okay, no. The embryo the ovum from the woman has her DNA, and the sperm from the man has his DNA. But when the two come together at the moment of conception, we have a completely new DNA. And so that, from a scientific perspective, this is not a religious argument, from a scientific perspective, we know that means that there is now a new human entity. So what we've established at this stage is that we have something that's alive, And at the moment of conception, it's a new DNA. So it's something new. It's not just part of the woman's body. The next stage, this is a fact, if you have human parents, you are human offspring. And this is because species reproduce after their own kind. We don't see whales having sharks. We don't see sharks having cats. We see every species reproducing after their own kind. And every once in a while with the young people, I like to joke, be like, I am really thankful for that fact because I intend to be a mother one day. I hope to be a mother. And I'm just really thankful that I'm going to know what species is going to come out of my body. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not a question. It's not an unknown. It's not, a lottery, like, it's a whale this time and a hedgehog this time. It's always going to be a human being coming out of me. Praise God. And so again, a human female and a human male, they reproduce, they will make a human fetus. Now, I've been using the term fetus, and I like to use that because, first of all, it makes pro-abortion or pro-choice people feel a little bit less on edge. They seem to get a little edgy when you use the term baby or child. But then you get to hit them with this fact, which is that fetus doesn't actually tell you what you're talking about. It doesn't answer the question of what species are you talking about or referring to. All it tells you is what stage of development that thing is at, that species is at. So you can have dog fetuses, you can have cat fetuses, and yes, you can have human fetuses. And so when we're talking about an unborn child, I prefer the term unborn child because I think it's respectful. I once had a feminist professor argue that at every baby shower, we shouldn't use the term baby. We should call it a fetus shower. So congratulate people on their fetuses and say fetus shower. I just think that's really disrespectful. And I think it's unnecessary. The term fetus is not a very attractive word, in my opinion. It's very Latin. And so I just think it makes a lot more sense to say unborn child. But if you prefer human fetus, then it communicates the same information. But when someone then comes at you, so when you're in conversation and someone says, well, it's just a fetus, that's where you catch them and you say, okay, but what kind of fetus? Because there are human fetuses, cat fetuses, dog fetuses, and again, humans reproduce after their own kind. So it's not going to be a dog or a cat, it's going to be a human. And that matters. And so at this stage, what we've established is that we have a separate living human entity, has a separate DNA. It's not part of the woman's body. It is human because of the parents. So we have a separate living human entity. And then we have the last stage, which is super quick, which is the question of, okay, what do you do with separate living human entities? And the fact is that humans are valuable. And I've had people argue that that's just a religious idea, that I only think that because I'm a Christian, and that really humans have no more valuable than animals, humans have no more value than animals. But the reality is that even our secular society understands that human life is valuable and treats human life as very different from the lives of animals or plants and that kind of thing. And so we see that there are consequences for rape, murder, other crimes against humanity. We recognize that there is harm that's done to a separate living human individual when these crimes occur, and therefore we vindicate that individual, and we bring justice by establishing consequences because there is harm to a valuable human life. And so again, just by going through those three stages, we know if something's growing, it's considered alive. We know that human parents have human offspring, and we know that humans, according to our secular society, are valuable. According to those three conclusions, we can come to the conclusion, that humans, that the unborn child is a separate living entity. I won't go through all of these, but these are all embryology textbooks that state that human life begins at conception. So after the process known as fertilization, we see that the fertilized ovum, known as a zygote, is the beginning or primordium of a human being. So all of these, I mean, some of these go back to 1975, which might not be very old that was before I was born, but it might not be for some of you. But like, this is not a new conclusion. We've known for a really, really long time that human life begins at conception. This is something that we've known for a really, really long time. we see here zygote represents the beginning of a human being. Although life is a continuous process, fertilization is a critical landmark because under ordinary circumstances, a new genetically distinct human organism is thereby formed, right? So all of these, we have some going back to 1975, and we have some newer ones. All of these state the same thing. And so the conclusion is that the fetus is, in fact, a separate living human entity. Now, at this point in the conversation, you kind of think, phew, like, great, okay, we established it. That was super simple. But then people say, okay, hang on a second. Sorry, so the conclusion, if the fetus is a separate living, distinct human being, the conclusion is that no justification for abortion is adequate because the preborn child is a separate human being deserving of the same rights and freedoms as the mother. And before I go on to that next point, I'll just say I emphasize that it's the same because we as pro-lifers aren't arguing that, we're only pro-baby, that we are only pro-child. We're here saying that we're pro-life. And so what that means is when there is the possibility to ensure that both lives are protected and are able to safely traverse through the pregnancy entirely, in those contexts, we want to protect the rights of both the woman and the unborn child. And so it's not about saying one is more important than the other. It's about saying that life is valuable, and just like the woman's life is valuable, the unborn child's life is equally valuable. And so it's a very equitable response. And there are contexts where not every life can be saved. The context of ectopic pregnancies comes to mind. There are serious complications, and so in those contexts, you save the lives that can be saved. And frequently that will just be the woman's life. But the pro-life position is not one that emphasizes the woman over the child or the child over the woman. It's about saying that both lives matter and are equally valuable. Now, this is what I was getting at. So sometimes you get to the end of the humanity argument and you think, wow, this is awesome. We've established something very important. We've made ground. And then someone comes to you and says, okay, hang on a second. The unborn child might be human, but it's not a person. And so what that means is that even though it's a human being, it's not a legal person and shouldn't have the same rights. So I'm going to skim through this because I think personhood is just one of the silliest concepts imaginable. But the quick, long, and short of it is that pro-abortion people will often argue that legal personhood goes beyond humanity. So just because you're a human being doesn't mean that you're a legal person. And they'll often bring up examples like the unborn child doesn't have a heartbeat yet, or brain waves, or two big ones are sensation. It can't feel pain or feel. It doesn't have a nervous system at certain points during the pregnancy, or sentience. It's not conscious. It's not aware of its own existence. So I think that personhood is, quite frankly, a meaningless term. I don't think it adds any value to the conversation. And I would actually point to examples in history where the term personhood and this idea of legal persons has been used to exploit and oppress certain groups. And so we can look at slavery. The law said that in the eyes of the law, the slave is not a person. Note that it doesn't argue that it's not a human being, that, African-American individuals weren't human beings. They couldn't deny that fact. But in order to oppress and discriminate against differently people who are of different appearance and people who were African American or of different descent and ethnicity, in order to be able to legally discriminate against them, they created this idea of personhood so that they could get around the biologicality and scientific reality of their humanity. And we see that this took place. We see the same thing happening in many parts of North America with Native Americans or First Nations people, as we often refer to them here. We see the quote being, an Indian is not a person within the meaning of the Constitution. Again, lawmakers couldn't argue with the reality that First Nations individuals and Native Americans were human beings deserving of value and the same rights as everyone else, but because they wanted to justify confiscating their land and their property and discriminating against them as well, they used this idea of personhood and said that they're not legal persons. We see the same thing actually happening to women not that long ago, 1928. There was this rule that came out of the Supreme Court of Canada that said women are not persons in matters of rights and privileges. And so again, the very same thing, they couldn't argue that women weren't human beings, but they could argue that we weren't legal persons, whatever that means. And that justified there being an oppressive, discriminatory stance against women that meant that we didn't have the same rights as men. And then we, again, in a very famous example, we see the same thing happening in Nazi Germany, where the law at the time refused to recognize Jews as persons under the law. And again, this was less than 100 years ago. And so the conclusion that I come to, and this is just a quick way that you can dispense with the personhood argument, is that history shows us that when personhood and humanity as concepts are separated, major human rights atrocities occur. And really the separation of these concepts results in lawmakers being able to arbitrarily decide who gets legal personhood and who doesn't, who gets rights and who doesn't. And when you separate those two realities, then often what happens is lawmakers will pick something arbitrary, like your skin color, your ethnicity, your gender, or your race, maybe in, religion, that kind of thing, and they'll use that to say, therefore, you don't have rights. And so I would argue that, the only logically sound and consistent foundation for this idea of legal personhood is humanity. And what that means is every human being is a person, and to separate those two creates grounds for a lot of discrimination. Now, I'm cognizant of the time, so I'm going to be quick, but I wanted to review some of the content that I would have reviewed in the virtual talks, because I know I had to go through that really quickly. And I mentioned at the beginning that I like to use these terms of pro-woman, pro-choice, and pro-life. And so maybe just as a refresher, what does that mean? I like to refer to myself as pro-woman, pro-choice, and pro-life. And I started doing that after my feminist classes, because in my feminist classes, I had a lot of people using these terms and labels, saying that pro-life people are anti-women and anti-choice, that we're bigoted and discriminatory, that kind of thing. And I always found that really weird, because I am a woman and I love women and I love choice. And so I was always confused as to how people could actually believe that pro-lifers were hateful towards women, when first of all, so many of us are women, but so much of what motivates me is that I care about women, and that I genuinely believe that women deserve better than abortion, and that we do a disservice to women when we just provide them with abortion instead of other options. When parenting isn't a viable option, and when adoption often isn't a viable option because it takes so long in Canada, are we really being fair to women who are experiencing really difficult crisis pregnancies? And so I started saying that I was pro-woman, pro-choice, and pro-life. And I started saying it because it gave me enough time to it confused people just long enough that I could then be able to respond to some of their specific critiques of the pro-life worldview. So this is kind of the high-level 5-minute version. So I would first argue that this idea of choice is a very convoluted one. So I would argue that if you're pro-life, you are pro-choice in that you probably are advocating for parenting and adoption. You're arguing for different choices. I also, as an individual, I'm a young woman. I love choice in the proper context. I believe that I should be able to choose what degree I want to pursue, what university I go to, where I live. I should be able to have these rights. I should choose who I get to vote for, what career I'd like to pursue. and so I, as a young woman, I'm very thankful for my right to choose, but I'm also cognizant that as an adult, my rights and choices come with responsibilities and restrictions. And so I can't choose to do whatever I want. I can't choose to do exactly what I want with my body because that might harm another individual. And that's why we have laws around, guns and weapons and that kind of thing, thank God, because we recognize that even if an individual chooses to own a firearm, or own something that could hurt someone, or chooses to make poor decisions that could harm other people, there are restrictions that go with that. And so just like I recognize that as an adult my rights come with restrictions, ultimately it's about my rights ending where someone else's rights begin. And so I can do what I want within restrictions, but I can't take away or hurt the rights of another individual. And so similarly, I recognize as a young person that, the rights of a woman are very important, that she can choose what career she wants to pursue, what degree she wants to pursue, if she wants to pursue one. She can choose often the circumstances of how she controls her reproductive system. But the moment that you're dealing with another human being, which we've already established you are in the context of a pregnancy, that's where your rights as a woman, or her rights as a woman, end, because the rights of another human being begin. I also think the idea of choice, like, it's a very arbitrary idea, like this idea of being pro-choice. Like, it would be horrible. It would be horrible to say you're pro-choice in some contexts based on what choice you're talking about, right? If someone said I'm pro-choice in the context of sexual assault, we would say that's horrible. Please stay far away from me. And similarly, in this context, I would argue that I'm anti-choice when it comes to abortion, because abortion is very harmful both to the woman and especially to the child. But I'm very pro-choice in that I think people should be making responsible choices. And I'm a huge advocate of having adoption and parenting be viable options for women facing crisis pregnancies. So all of that to say, I just think that we shouldn't give people ground. The pro-abortion movement has kind of co-opted the language of choice, and I think we should be careful with that. I also would like to point out that there's coerced abortion that happens, and one of the main reasons why I do what I do is because I believe women shouldn't be forced to have abortions, and it's something that happens in other countries, and we often think of China being an example, especially under the one-child policy when it was still in place. But even this case, this article that I've cited here indicated that approximately 64% of post-abortive women felt pressure from other people to have an abortion. And that's a reality that many of my friends have faced. I know many women who are post-abortive and they only did it because of the pressure from other people. So again, that kind of complicates the pro-choice argument, right? And so as a pro-life person, when I fight against coerced abortion, I would argue that I am being pro-choice, because I think women should not be forced to have an abortion. There's also this idea of pro-life people being anti-woman. And I really don't have a lot of time for this argument, just because there are so many pro-life women, and there are so many pro-life women like Lia, for example, who are actually leading organizations and leading the charge. I also would point to sex selection abortion. As pro-lifers, we're very against that. We know that it's something that happens, and it's something that a lot of pro-abortion people are avoiding talking about because it makes them very uncomfortable, and it reminds them that there is something wrong with the way abortion is used, especially when it promotes sexism and misogyny, right? And so as a pro-life feminist, sometimes I use that term. I'm a traditional feminist, not one of the third or fourth wave ones. But as a young pro-life woman, I am pro-life because I care about women, because I believe that women are being harmed by abortion. And so again, this is another way that you can use the term and kind of co-opt that language, if that makes sense. So I'm cognizant of the time, so I'll probably wrap it up there. There are more things I can talk about, but I want want to be respectful of your guys' time, and I'd love to hear some of the questions you guys have. So I'm just gonna stop sharing and pass it over to Aaliyah. Oh, I think you're on mute. It happens to all of us.
See, this is the exact thing. Thank you, Lia. That is awesome. You really went through so many of the core concepts there. So we will just now pause for